The oil in the DP-27 had turned to molasses. Again. Vasily Petrov pressed his face against the frozen earth, watching German infantry advance through the birch stumps. The temperature gauge read -38°C. The DP-27 record player would not cycle its 47-round Pan magazine. The oil had thickened to paste overnight. Beside him, the fresh lieutenant was sweating despite the cold, his finger twitching on his Tokarev, his breathing too fast and too loud, steam rising off him in visible clouds that any trained observer could spot from 100 meters out. The kid had arrived 3 days ago with crisp insignia and regulation firing charts. Charts that said engage at 400 meters. Charts written by men who had never felt machine gun oil freeze solid in their hands, never watched a weapon become an inert piece of metal at the exact moment their life depended on it cycling. Vasily had crawled 18 days on shattered legs through these same forests. 18 days of eating bark and drinking his own piss while German patrols stepped over his motionless body. He had learned patience the way other men learned to breathe, not as a technique, not as a discipline, as something closer to instinct, the body teaching itself what the mind could not be told. 15 meters. The lead German's breath misted in the air, close enough to see the frost on his eyebrows, close enough to smell the ersatz coffee on his uniform, close enough to see the boy beneath the gray wool, 19 years old at most, scared in the particular way that young men get scared when they sense something wrong but cannot name it. 10 meters. 50 meters, the lieutenant hissed, quoting regulations. We should have fired at 50. 5 meters. Vasily opened up. That was the lesson the Eastern Front taught to anyone who survived long enough to learn it. Not the academic lesson. Not the lesson that came with citations and references and official approval. The kind of lesson that lives in your hands afterward. The kind your hands remember even when your mind tries to forget. Not the lesson printed in staff college manuals. Not the lesson recited in morning briefings. The real lesson, written in frozen corpses and failed assaults and the sound of machine guns jamming at the worst possible moment. Survival required ignoring everything you had been taught and trusting what the war had burned into you. The war had very specific opinions about regulations, and those opinions were expressed entirely in dead men. The veterans who understood this truth came back from the early disasters carrying it like shrapnel. Broken men, frostbitten, carrying 18-day nightmares on frozen legs, men like Alexei Meresiev, who crawled half a month through enemy territory on shattered bones, who lost both feet to the surgeon's saw and still climbed back into a fighter cockpit, still shot down German aircraft with stumps where his feet had been, still filed accurate after-action reports about engagement distances and aircraft performance. These were not the soldiers Moscow wanted to put on propaganda posters. They were the ones who had watched panzer divisions roll through Soviet positions like harvesting wheat, who had seen T-34s burn while entire crews screamed inside, who knew exactly what worked and what got you killed, and who carried that knowledge like a stone in the chest everywhere they went. The replacements arrived weekly. Fresh uniforms, regulation confidence. Young officers straight off the train from Moscow, 3 weeks removed from staff college, quoting engagement distances and firing tables with the certainty of men who had never seen a textbook tactic stop a bullet. They arrived with perfectly pressed uniforms and the particular confidence of people who have studied a subject without ever encountering the subject itself. The friction started immediately and continued until the regulations killed them or the war educated them. Sergeant Volkov explained it carefully to yet another fresh face. The machine gun oil freezes solid below -30°C. the 47-round Pan magazines develop spring tension problems. The firing pins lose their snap. The maintenance schedule needs modification, or the weapons become expensive clubs at the exact moment you need them to be weapons. The lieutenant replied that the manual specifies standard lubrication procedures and that doctrine would be followed as written. Volkov had watched 3 companies die following doctrine. His own DP-27 had jammed during a German counterattack outside Tula, oil thick as paste, the record player silent while Stuka screamed overhead. He had fought the rest of that engagement with an entrenching tool, steel blade against Wehrmacht skulls, up close, personal. The way it always ended when the machinery failed and doctrine had nothing left to offer. The gap between what the manuals taught and what killed you could swallow entire armies. It had already swallowed several. The veterans counted them in their heads sometimes, the units that had gone into the line believing in their equipment and their doctrine and come out as nothing at all. The regulations assumed weapons fired when you pulled the trigger. The regulations had not spent a winter on the Eastern Front. The veterans knew other truths the regulations never addressed. How to lie motionless on ice for 8 hours without moving a single muscle, controlling the shiver response through a discipline that had no name because it had never needed naming in peacetime. How to recognize the sound of German jackboots on frozen ground from 300 meters, the particular crunch and drag of soldiers who had not learned to move quietly because nothing in their training had required it. How to kill silently with bare hands when ammunition ran out, and the cold had made every weapon useless. They had learned that German soldiers feared the dark because Soviet troops owned it. Wehrmacht diaries recovered from corpses told the story over and over, in different handwriting, the same horror. Night happy was how they described the enemy. Closer to nature, inhuman patience, supernatural endurance. The fresh officers called these techniques irregular, undisciplined, not according to regulations. They called the veterans insubordinate when they failed to follow procedures, resistant to proper military bearing. What they meant was that the veterans were alive, and the veterans were alive precisely because they had stopped being easy to kill. Walter Schaefer-Keinert was Wehrmacht, a machine gunner who understood his MG-42 with an intimacy born of combat. Rate of fire 1,200 rounds per minute. Effective range 1,500 meters. Devastating against infantry in the open. He later told interrogators what the Eastern Front winter had done to that confidence. When the temperature dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius, he said, their machine guns stopped firing. Completely. Without warning. Full mechanism simply refusing to function. That really makes you afraid. But Soviet veterans had already adapted long before Schaefer-Keinert learned his lesson. They had wrapped their weapons in rags, kept spare oil inside their jackets where body heat prevented freezing, slept with their weapons pressed against their chests like infants, modified ammunition loads for point-blank engagement when reliability at range became a fantasy. The textbook said 800 meters was maximum effective range. The veterans knew better. Wait until you can see their eyes. Then kill everything that moves. Lieutenant Kozlov insisted on regulation tactics for the attack. It would commence at 0600 hours. Artillery preparation. Infantry advance in 3 waves. Engagement at prescribed distances. The temperature was minus 34 Celsius when he briefed the plan, and the veterans in the room exchanged the kind of looks that required no words because the words had all been said before and none of them had mattered. Sergeant Borisenko tried again. The machine gun oil is frozen solid. We need to wait for temperature increase or modify procedures. The attack proceeds as planned, Kozlov replied. We follow Soviet military doctrine. Borisenko had seen this movie before. new officers, old mistakes, fresh graves already waiting somewhere in the frozen ground. The artillery fired for 30 minutes on schedule. The shells burst in white puffs against the frozen ground. Minimal damage, maximum noise. The Germans knew exactly what was coming and had 30 minutes to prepare for it. First wave went over the top at 0600 sharp. Textbook formation, regulation spacing. The MG-42 Ness opened up at 400 meters, just as the manual specified. The DP-27 record players managed 3 bursts before the mechanism seized. Thick oil, frozen firing pins, magazine springs moving like cold honey through a cold straw. The German guns did not freeze. Better winterization developed from bitter experience. They chewed through the first wave like a threshing machine through dry grain. Borisenko watched boys from Stalingrad and Kiev die because their weapons would not cycle. Watched them try to advance with rifles that would not fire. Bolt action Mosin Nagants with actions frozen solid, soldiers cycling the bolts frantically, achieving nothing, advancing anyway because the order had been given, and following orders was all they knew how to do. The second wave lasted 4 minutes. Same result, different corpses. The frozen ground received them without ceremony. By the third wave, surviving veterans had made their modifications. They had kept spare rifles inside their jackets, wrapped weapons in stolen German blankets, used body heat to keep mechanisms functional, sacrificing warmth for mechanical reliability, understanding that the weapon was the thing keeping them warm in any meaningful sense. Borisenko waited until the German machine gun position was 50 meters away, then 40, then 30. He could see the gunner's face, a young man, maybe 17, scared in the way Borisenko had once been scared before fear became too familiar to matter. The PPSH-41 submachine gun worked at point-blank range, 7.6 2mm bullets at 900 rounds per minute. The German position went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with proximity. Lieutenant Kozlov died trying to follow regulations. Frozen rifle, textbook tactics. The veterans finished the attack with entrenching tools and rifle butts. Close work, brutal work, the kind of work that left marks on you that had nothing to do with wounds. The dirty secret spread through veteran units like contagion. Forget the engagement tables. Ignore the firing distances. Let them get close. Then kill everything. Official doctrine prescribed opening fire at 400 to 800 meters. Maximum. Theoretical effectiveness. Clean. Distant. Regulation. The veterans knew better. They had learned the 50-meter rule in blood and frozen corpses, and the particular education that comes from surviving what should have killed you. Senior Sergeant Fedorovich had perfected the technique over the course of a year of combat that had taken everything he had brought into it and replaced it with something harder and more precise. He had started the war believing what he had been taught. He had ended the war believing what had kept him alive, which was a different curriculum entirely. His squad would dig camouflaged positions 30 meters from known German patrol routes, then wait, sometimes for days, burning less than 1,000 calories, moving nothing that did not have to move, becoming a feature of the landscape rather than a threat within it. He later described what that waiting produced in close quarters. They clutched tightly in mortal combat, he wrote. They fought hand-to-hand in the trenches using entrenchment tools, rifle butts, fingernails, anything available, anything that could be made to serve the purpose. The psychological impact was devastating in ways that conventional combat could not replicate. German patrol reports described Soviet positions that seemed empty, then erupted in sudden death at conversational distance. Muzzle flashes in their faces, steel blades in their guts. Men who had been walking forward one moment and were simply not existing the next. The Wehrmacht started avoiding certain sectors, areas where Soviet veterans practiced point-blank warfare, where textbook tactics went to die and fresh replacements learned in the worst possible classroom. New officers could not understand the effectiveness. Why not engage at maximum range? Why allow the enemy to close distance? The veterans tried to explain. Ammunition conservation, weapon reliability, kill probability. The simple arithmetic of hitting a target you are touching versus a target. You cannot reliably see. Mostly, they did not bother. Let the fresh ones learn the hard way, if they survived. Captain Antonov graduated top of his class from Frunze Military Academy, expert in combined arms tactics, specialist in offensive operations, completely unprepared for reality in the specific way that experts in theory are always unprepared for what the thing actually does when it encounters the world. His first attack followed doctrine precisely. Artillery preparation, infantry advance in successive waves, support weapons providing covering fire from designated positions. The attack lasted 47 minutes. Casualty rate 83%. Objective not achieved. Sergeant Major Grigori watched boys die because their captain believed in textbook tactics. After the failed attack, Grigori approached carefully. Perhaps we should consider alternative approaches, he said, choosing words that would not trigger the defense mechanisms that regulation-confident officers developed when their doctrine was questioned. We follow Soviet military doctrine, Antonov replied. The attack will be repeated tomorrow with corrected timing. The second attack achieved similar results. More corpses, same targets, same failure, identical mistakes made by different men who had not yet died enough times to learn. By the third day, surviving veterans had taken matters entirely into their own hands. They ignored the wave attack orders. Infiltrated German positions using night approach techniques the regulations had no language for. Close work, silent killing, throat-cutting efficiency that left no noise and no survivors to call for help. While Antonov planned his fourth regulation assault, the veterans had already eliminated the German machine gun position standing between the company and its objective. Individual initiative, practical tactics, results achieved without a single reference to proper procedure. Private Kolesnikov mastered the 50-meter principle with anti-tank rifles. Regulation doctrine called for long-range engagement of armor. Keep your distance. Coordinate with supporting units. Use cover. Everything logical and safe and utterly useless when you are outnumbered and outgunned at every range the manual considered appropriate. Kolesnikov waited until a Ferdinand self-propelled gun was close enough to touch, close enough to see the rivets on its hull, close enough to put rounds exactly where he needed them to go. He hit the vehicle under its turret where the heaviest armor ended and something more vulnerable began. The heaviest armored hood bounced off like a light ball, he said, but 5 bullets from a PTR anti-tank rifle at contact distance found the gap that regulations said did not exist, and the Ferdinand exploded like an ammunition dump. Armor plating scattered for 50 meters. The German crew never saw what killed them. One moment, advancing in a 60-ton vehicle that nothing was supposed to be able to stop. Next moment, vaporized by a man with a rifle and the patience to wait for the right distance. That was the beauty of the 50-meter rule. Perfect surprise. Maximum damage. Psychological devastation that rippled through every German unit that received the after-action report. The Ferdinand weighed over 60 tons. It had been designed to be invulnerable at the ranges where the regulations said engagement should occur. No one had designed it to withstand a man who was willing to get close enough to smell the exhaust. The regulations protected the machine. The veterans protected themselves by ignoring the regulations. German soldiers began describing Soviet troops as supernatural, invisible until they struck, patient beyond human endurance, night-happy predators who owned the darkness in a way that the Wehrmacht had not trained for and could not prepare against. The Wehrmacht developed countermeasures, larger patrols, different routes, constant movement designed to deny the patience that made Soviet veterans so effective. But the veterans adapted faster. They learned to lie motionless on ice for 18 hours without detection, controlling every biological function that might betray their position. To breathe so shallowly that body heat would not melt the snow above their faces. To strike from positions the enemy had already checked and cleared, using the German security routine itself as cover. One scout escaped detection by having a local elderly woman pretend to recognize him as her grandson during a German patrol check. "Yes, he is mine," she said without hesitation, with the particular conviction of a woman who has decided what she is going to do and is not afraid of the consequences. "I sent him to fetch kindling." "What kept you so long?" The patrol moved on. 30 seconds later, the scout killed their rear guard with a knife. Silent, close, personal. No rounds expended, no noise to attract attention. Obergefreiter Klaus Müller wrote his final letter home 3 days before a Soviet night attack found him. "They appear from nowhere," he wrote. "Yesterday we swept this sector twice and found nothing. Today Heinz is dead with his throat cut 50 meters from our position. No one heard anything. No one saw anything. They are like animals now." Private Dmitry Volkov perfected the art of invisible movement over months of practice and several near deaths that served as useful corrections to his technique. He could crawl 2 kilometers across frozen ground without disturbing a single blade of dead grass. Could maintain position for 36 hours without moving enough to crack the ice crystals forming on the surface around him. His technique was simple in description and required everything a person had to execute. Become the landscape. Think like snow. Move like wind. Breathe like frozen earth. German sentries would stare directly at his position and see nothing. Undisturbed terrain. No threat. Then, when the distance was right and the moment was correct, he would end the threat assessment permanently. Soviet commanders began receiving intelligence reports that seemed impossible. German positions abandoned without explanation. Entire squads found dead with no signs of combat. Equipment undisturbed, but crews missing. The veterans were hunting in coordinated packs now. Systematic elimination. Psychological warfare executed by men who had never read the textbook, but had written chapters of their own in blood and silence. Lieutenant Schroeder commanded a German machine gun nest overlooking a key river crossing. Strategic position, clear fields of fire, perfect defensive terrain. His crew held the position for 6 days with no Soviet activity. On the 7th night, they simply disappeared. A Soviet patrol found the position abandoned. Machine guns still in place. Ammunition undisturbed. No blood, no struggle, no explanation for where 6 armed men had gone. 3 days later, Wehrmacht intelligence found the crew's bodies 8 kilometers away, arranged in a circle, throats cut. A message carved in German into the frozen ground. "The night belongs to us." The Dnieper crossing should have been impossible by every reasonable calculation. German defensive positions commanded every approach. Artillery registered on all potential ford sites. Machine guns covering probable landing areas with overlapping fields of fire designed by men who knew their business. Textbook analysis concluded the operation would require massive casualties. the kind of losses that commanders write about as acceptable and then cannot sleep over afterward. Senior Lieutenant Komarov studied the river differently: bottom topology, current patterns, depth measurements at different points, then proposed something that violated every engineering manual ever written for armored vehicle operation. 60 T-34 tanks would cross the Dnieper underwater. The plan seemed insane in the specific way that all genuinely effective ideas seem insane before they work. T-34s were not submarines. No snorkeling equipment existed. No waterproofing systems had been developed for this purpose. The chief mechanic protested with the full authority of a man who understood exactly what he was talking about. Water pressure will crush the seals, he explained. The engines will flood. The crews will drown. This violates every engineering principle. Komarov had been listening to experts for 3 years. Experts who had been right about everything except the most important things. Seal them anyway, he said. The putty came from abandoned German supplies, enemy materials enabling the most audacious river crossing in military history. The irony was noted by no one because irony was the only constant in this war, and everyone had stopped remarking on it. Veteran tank crews sealed every opening with whatever would hold, wrapped vulnerable components in waterproof materials stripped from destroyed vehicles, modified air intake systems using salvaged German equipment, calculated buoyancy adjustments using fuel load manipulation. The engineering was crude but functional in the specific way that desperate improvisation sometimes achieves what formal engineering declares impossible. Putty-sealed hulls, improvised breathing apparatus made from salvaged rubber tubes, and air hoses stripped from pneumatic systems. Anything that could carry oxygen from the river surface to sealed crew compartments 20 feet below. German intelligence never considered underwater tank assault. Their defensive plans assumed surface crossing, conventional tactics, predictable approach routes that could be registered and turned into killing grounds. They had planned for every reasonable possibility. They had not planned for tanks that swam because tanks did not swim, and the men who designed the defensive plan were not veterans of the Eastern Front, and therefore still believed in the reliability of reasonable expectations. The first T-34 disappeared beneath the water surface at 0347 hours. Then another, 60 tanks vanishing into the dark river like steel submarines. German observation posts reported normal river conditions. Unusual turbulence noted in one report. Nothing warranting attention. The tanks crossed at walking speed, crews breathing through improvised snorkels, navigating by compass and pure instinct, following the riverbed's contours toward the German shore without visibility, without reference points, without any way to know if the putty was holding. 20 minutes underwater. 20 minutes of mechanical prayer while German artillery pounded empty water on the surface behind them. 47 T-34s reached the opposite shore. 13 were lost to mechanical failure or navigation errors in the dark. But 47 Soviet tanks had appeared behind German defensive positions without warning and without a single German soldier having seen them coming. The psychological impact was total and immediate. Tanks materialized from empty ground. The entire defensive line had been designed around the assumption that the river was a barrier, and the barrier had simply ceased to function as one. German defenders fled. The veterans had done something the enemy's imagination could not accommodate. And imagination is the final line of defense when all the prepared positions have been outflanked. Official reports would never mention the putty-sealed tanks. Military doctrine could not acknowledge tactics that violated engineering principles. The operation remained classified because it proved The regulations were wrong, and regulations could not afford to be wrong. The night attack against the German 112th Infantry Division defied every principle of tactical stealth in the same deliberate way. Soviet tanks advanced with headlights blazing and sirens wailing. Maximum visibility, maximum noise, maximum psychological impact. Fresh officers observing could not process the logic. Why announce your approach? Why eliminate the surprise advantage? Why transform your vehicles into obvious targets visible for kilometers in every direction? The veterans knew better. They had learned that terror was more valuable than stealth in specific tactical situations. Human minds cannot process impossible confidence. Soldiers expect enemies to hide, to seek advantage through concealment, to avoid detection as a matter of survival instinct. When an enemy violates this expectation completely, the defender's tactical reasoning collapses, trying to explain what it is seeing. Soviet tanks, attacking with headlights blazing, suggested not recklessness, but supernatural power, overwhelming strength, complete contempt for German defensive capability. Wehrmacht machine gun crews found themselves aiming at blinding light sources. Impossible to judge distance, impossible to track movement accurately, impossible to maintain accuracy while fighting night blindness. The air raid sirens added a second layer of psychological confusion. Sirens meant bombs, Luftwaffe, attacks, death from above. But these sirens came from ground level, from advancing armor, from something that did not fit the category the sound was supposed to indicate. Tank Commander Sergeant Petrov led the headlight assault with all lights blazing, the siren wailing, the main gun firing high explosive rounds at predetermined coordinates. German defenders shot at light sources and hit nothing. Their muzzle flashes revealed their exact positions while achieving no tactical results. Meanwhile, Soviet infantry advanced in darkness on either side of the illuminated tanks, completely invisible, while the defenders stared into blazing headlights and tried to make their tactical reasoning work in conditions it had not been designed for. The 112th Infantry Division dissolved in complete panic. Soldiers fled their equipment. Officers abandoned command posts. Entire units disintegrated because headlights had destroyed their tactical reasoning more effectively than artillery had been able to. The veterans had achieved complete tactical surprise using engineering impossibility that no defensive planner had considered because no defensive planner believed it was possible. They had done the impossible not because they were extraordinary men, but because they were ordinary men who had been forced by necessity to discard the boundaries that defined what was possible. The final confrontation came during the push toward Königsberg. Major Volkov commanded a company of survivors, men who had crawled on broken legs and waited in frozen positions and learned every lesson the Eastern Front had to teach through the only reliable method it offered. Captain Fedorov arrived from Staff College with regulation solutions. The argument started over machine gun employment. Fedorov insisted on regulation engagement distances, 400 to 800 meters, standard doctrine. Volkov's veterans had modified their DP-27 record. Players for point-blank combat, stripped unnecessary components, improved reliability in cold conditions, adapted for close-range killing. The enemy must be engaged at maximum effective range. Fedorov explained, we establish overlapping fields of fire according to regulation parameters. Comrade Captain, Volkov replied, regulation parameters will get everyone killed. We wait until they are close enough to smell. Then we kill everything that moves. The test came during German counterattack. Fedorov positioned his machine guns according to doctrine. 400-meter engagement distance, regulation spacing. The German attack developed exactly as anticipated. Fedorov's guns opened fire at regulation distance. Professional technique. Results: minimal casualties inflicted, maximum ammunition expended. German infantry took cover and called for artillery support. Standard response: regulation warfare meeting regulation defense in a draw that cost ammunition and solved nothing. Meanwhile, Volkov's veterans waited in camouflage positions. The German infantry came past the 400-meter mark, past 200. At 50 meters, the veterans opened fire. DP-27 record players chattered their distinctive mechanical rhythm. 47 round magazines emptying in continuous bursts at point-blank accuracy. The German attack disintegrated. Infantry casualties approaching 90%. Surviving soldiers fleeing, armored support retreating without infantry protection. Captain Fedorov watched his regulation tactics achieve minimal results while veteran improvisation destroyed an entire enemy assault. His textbook, Knowledge versus Their Bloody Experience. The lesson was impossible to argue with, though it would not change the manuals. The victory reports never mentioned the veteran techniques. Official histories ignored the tactical innovations. Military doctrine could not acknowledge that the regulations were wrong. The most effective Soviet tactics of the entire Eastern Front campaign violated military law: 50-meter engagement distances, underwater tank crossings, night attacks with blazing illumination, individual initiative over unit coordination. Every innovation that saved lives broke a regulation designed to preserve order, and order was what the regulations were actually for. The veterans who mastered reality-based warfare paid a price beyond physical wounds. They had learned that official procedures got people killed, that survival required creative disobedience, that effectiveness meant ignoring direct orders and trusting the education the war had provided at the highest possible tuition rate. These men could not return to peacetime thinking, could not trust authority that had tried to kill them with its own procedures. They had seen too many fresh officers die following textbook tactics, and the textbooks never updated to reflect where those officers had ended up. The record player's song carried a message that no official document would record: the distinctive sound of adapted weapons, modified tactics, veteran knowledge that could not be taught in schools or written into manuals because it had been purchased with something schools and manuals could not provide. You could describe the 50-meter rule to someone, and they would understand it intellectually and still get themselves killed at regulation distance, because they had not yet developed the instinct to disobey. The reflexive distrust of doctrine that only came from watching doctrine fail enough times to make the lesson permanent. Private Khrushchev found himself face to face with a German grenadier in a frozen shell crater. His PPSH submachine gun was empty. The German Schmeisser had jammed. 2 men, 2 empty weapons, 2 choices. Khrushchev used his entrenching tool like his grandfather had used a woodsman's axe. 1 casual swing, clean and final. The regulations never covered that sound, the wet thunk of steel meeting flesh and bone, the brief gurgle, the sudden silence, war reduced to its most essential and least discussable form. Vasily Borisov articulated the lesson that all of them carried decades later. The commanders used to say that the Siberian divisions saved Moscow, he said. There was man-to-man fighting. We had to fight the Germans in the trenches, and the fitter ones survived, and the weaker ones died. The fitter ones, not the better trained, not the more disciplined. The ones who adapted fastest to the reality that regulations existed to get you killed and that staying alive required something the regulations had no category for. The veterans who survived carried this knowledge like shrapnel, the kind embedded, too deep to remove without killing the patient. Fragments of deadly wisdom that had cost more to acquire than any formal education had ever cost anything. They understood that survival had required abandoning everything their training had taught them. The new boys who lived long enough learned the same lessons. Those who did not became footnotes in after-action reports, casualties of the adherence to doctrine in a war where doctrine meant death. The knowledge the veterans carried died with them. They never spoke of it at reunions, never mentioned it in memoirs, never taught it to their sons, because some knowledge is too terrible to pass along deliberately and can only be acquired the way they had acquired it, through the specific education of surviving what should have killed you over and over until the lesson was embedded deep enough to function automatically. The war's greatest lesson remained unwritten, that regulations kill and improvisation saves lives. That doctrine serves politicians while tactics serve soldiers. That the most effective warriors are those who learn to ignore their orders and trust the experience they have bought at the highest possible price. The veterans knew it. The veterans never forgot it. But veterans do not write the history books, and the history books record it. Something cleaner and more comfortable and almost entirely untrue. German accounts reveal the grudging respect the Wehrmacht ultimately developed for an enemy who fought beyond conventional military understanding. Night-happy warriors who lay motionless on ice for hours while patrols walked past them. Tanks that crossed rivers underwater. Infantry that preferred entrenching tools to rifles when close combat made rifles irrelevant. An army that won by forgetting everything armies were supposed to do and doing instead whatever the moment required, with the particular creativity that desperation produces when it has time to refine itself into technique. The DP-27 record player gathered dust in military museums, artifact of conventional warfare. Its placard mentioned effective range and magazine capacity. Nothing about the real song it played, the deadly music it made at 50 meters, the sound of regulations dying in frozen ground, the sound of victory through violation of everything. Warfare was supposed to be. The textbooks never recorded what actually won battles on the Eastern Front. Official histories mentioned combined arms tactics, coordination between infantry and armor, proper application of artillery support, and air cover. They never mentioned frozen machine gun oil or the 50-meter rule. Never described underwater tank crossings or psychological warfare through blazing headlights attached to advancing armor. The most effective fighters of the most brutal campaign in human history were forged in the crucible of ignoring orders and discovering that official procedures got people killed, and that survival required creative disobedience, repeated until it became instinct. The war ended. The regulations returned. The official histories recorded proper tactics and conventional operations. But somewhere in the archives, buried beneath layers of acceptable narrative, the real story waits. The story of veterans nobody wanted to hear. Men who learned that survival trumped doctrine. Men who turned warfare into something their instructors never imagined, and their commanders never acknowledged, and their governments never recorded. The record players fell silent. The underwater tanks returned to conventional operations. The 50-meter rule disappeared from tactical discussions. The headlights went dark, but the knowledge remained. Hidden in the eyes of scarred veterans who knew the difference between what the manual said and what actually worked when your life depended on mechanical function and improvised desperation. They carried it quietly, They carried it completely. They carried it to their graves. Silent guardians of tactical secrets that won a war by breaking every rule designed to fight one. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.